We have with us today Jeffrey Sussman, who's the author of 13 nonfiction books.
Correct.
And the most recent is the one that he's here to talk about today, which is Boxing and the Mob, the Notorious History of the Sweet Science. Jeffrey is also the author of 2 other books about boxing, and in addition to his writing, he runs a successful PR and marketing company that represents small and mid-sized businesses. Please welcome Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you, I'm glad to be here. Is this too loud? Am I too close to this microphone?
Probably don't even need it.
How is that? Is that good? Yeah. How many of you are interested in boxing, and how many are interested in the mob, and how many are interested in both? Is this both?
Yeah.
Both, okay. I have always been interested in boxing ever since I was 12 years old, when I was a skinny little kid, and my father was an amateur boxer, and he taught me the elements of boxing. He brought home one day a pair of boxing gloves, a jump rope, a speed bag, and a heavy bag, and he set them up in the basement and gave me boxing lessons. And then he was a friend of a man named Lou Stillman, who owned a famous boxing gym in New York City, and he took me over there and signed me up for 10 boxing lessons with a professional middleweight boxer. And I became a little full of myself after that, because I said to the guy who was teaching me boxing, here I was, this skinny little 12-year-old. I said, I'd like to get in the ring and box with someone. And he said, what are you, crazy? You'll get your head beaten in. But my father also introduced me to somebody when I was 13 years old, an uncle of his named Irving. And it was at my bar mitzvah, and it was the one and only time I met this man named Irving. And my father introduced me to him, and he handed me an envelope with a lot of money in it. And I never saw Irving again. And afterwards, I asked my father, who is Irving? It turned out that he was my father's uncle. I didn't see him very often. He had become a multimillionaire during Prohibition. He was a bootlegger. And my father's family was rather poor during the Depression. And Irving had a big mansion up in upstate New York next to Averell Harriman's mansion, who was the governor of New York in the 1950s. And during the Depression, he invited my father over there a few times, but he never gave my father's family any financial help. But what he did is he told my father how to bet on fixed fights. So he told him to bet on my father told me the first one he bet on was a fight with a fighter named Jack Sharkey. And Irving told him bet $75 on it, and you'll make $750. And then the next time he bet on a fighter named Primo Carnera, and he doubled or tripled his money, and he kept doing that on the advice of Irving. So I became fascinated not only by boxing, but also about fixed fights. And my father told me that so many of the boxing matches during the 1930s and 40s were fixed, and the public didn't know about it, much of this. So I started doing a lot of research into the subject, and I started off by examining a man named Arnold Rothstein, who is really the founder of organized crime in America as we now know it. His protégés, who came to him to learn how to be organized criminals, were Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, who were all boyhood pals. And they all worked together under Arnold Rothstein. Now, Arnold Rothstein fixed the 1919 World Series, the famous Black Sox scandal. And his bagman in that was a man named Abe Attell, who had been the featherweight boxing champion from 1906 to 1912. And after the fix was discovered and received a great deal of notoriety, Abe Attell was indicted and brought into a court in Chicago, and he had a lot of moxie. He was able to convince the judge and the jury that he was the wrong Abe Attell, that it was somebody else named Abe Attell, and they dismissed him, and he walked out of the courtroom. But Abe and Arnold realized after this event that it would be a lot easier to fix a boxing match than a baseball game. Because in a baseball game, you have to fix 9 players. In a boxing match, you only have to fix 1 boxer and maybe a judge. And so Abe Attell got very involved with fixing fights, and Arnold Rothstein was killed at the site of a poker game at the Park Central Hotel in 1928. And after his demise, his 4 protégés took over all the enterprises that he was involved in. And they all got involved heavily in bootlegging. And one of the people that they partnered with was a transplanted English gangster named Oni Madden, also known as Oni the Killer Madden, because he had previously been a member of a gang called the Gophers, and he had killed a number of people and served time in Sing Sing prison. After Prohibition ended, when Roosevelt became president, Oni Madden, who had become very, very wealthy from bootlegging, needed something else to make money from. And though he had incidentally been involved in boxing matches in a small way, he decided to get involved in a big way. And he bought a 50% interest in an Italian boxer who had really started out as a circus strongman named Primo Carnera, who was brought to the United States by his French manager. And Oni Madden saw this as an opportunity to make a lot of money. Primo Carnera looked like a heavyweight champion. He was probably the biggest boxer there ever was. I think he was 6'7" and weighed about 265 pounds. But he couldn't box. And Abe Attell had to give him lessons to make it at least passable that he could box. Well, Oni Madden threatened to kill the French manager, so he left the United States and went back to France. And Oni Madden and his cohorts took over the complete contract of Primo Carnera. And they fixed every single one of his fights until they got him to be the heavyweight champion of the world. And they were making millions and millions of dollars from him. In 1935, he fought a heavyweight contender named Max Baer. And at that time, Thomas Dewey was going after a lot of the mob figures in New York, and there was a lot of heat on Oni Madden. And he figured it was a good time to get out of boxing. So he didn't even try to fix the fight with Max Baer and Primo Carnera. Max Baer beat up Primo Carnera pretty badly. He knocked him down 11 times and broke a few of his ribs. He broke a bone in his forearm and in his jaw. And the mob completely dropped Primo Carnera. They took all of his money, they left him penniless and in the hospital. Max Baer felt so badly about what he had done to Primo Carnera that he paid all of Primo Carnera's hospital bills, and then went on to get Primo Carnera a career as a professional wrestler. And Primo was able to make back all of the money that the mob had stolen from him. And he was eternally grateful to Max Baer. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Cinderella Man. Well, it's a completely inaccurate portrayal of Max Baer. In that movie, he comes across as a sadistic, boorish, loud, very unattractive person. He was a very kind, he was a very gentle man. When he died in 1950, Primo Carnera was in Italy and couldn't get to California for the funeral. He arrived a week later and was late at night, and he had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max Baer was buried. And the cemetery gates were locked, and they climbed over the fence. They located Max's gravestone, and Primo Carnera bent down, said a prayer, and crossed himself, and then he said to his driver, "Max Baer was the best friend I ever had." And this kind of portrayal, I interviewed Max Baer's son, Max Baer Jr., who was in that TV show, The Beverly Hillbillies. And he was so upset at the portrayal of his father in Cinderella Man that he tried to sue Ron Howard. But you can't defame a dead person. So he had no grounds for bringing the lawsuit. But when he did question Ron Howard said to him, well, we needed a villain, and we chose him. We made Jimmy Braddock the good guy, and we made your father the bad guy. Tough. But that was totally inaccurate. And to get back to Oni Madden retired to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and he turned it into a resort for mobsters. So that when Thomas Dewey indicted Lucky Luciano for prostitution, Lucky Luciano hightailed it to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and hid out there for a year until he was finally extradited and brought back to New York. Oni Madden became sort of legitimate in Hot Springs, married the postmaster's daughter, and ran a hotel for mobsters who wanted to go to a resort or on the lam from the law or just wanted to remake themselves. And in his last few years, he became quite ill, and he required round-the-clock nursing care. And so he needed a woman to come in and take care of him 24 hours a day. And the woman who did that, who was his round-the-clock nurse, was Bill Clinton's mother, who took care of Oni Madden in his last days. Now after Oni Madden left, a man named Mike Jacobs, who was very entrepreneurial. He started out with nothing, and he became a ticket promoter, and the ticket promotion led to him eventually being able to control Madison Square Garden and all the fights that took place. And he owned the contract of Joe Louis, and set it up that as long as Joe Louis remained world heavyweight boxing champion, Mike Jacobs would get 10% of everything that Joe Louis earned. So Mike Jacobs was very careful to make sure that Joe Louis's opponents were not as good as Joe Louis, because he wanted him to remain the world heavyweight boxing champion for as long as possible. In the 1940s, Mike Jacobs had 2 strokes, and he retired to his mansion in New Jersey. Incidentally, I gave a talk about Max Baer and Mike Jacobs and some of these people 2 years ago when another boxing book came out, and Max Jacobs' niece came to my talk, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, you know, everyone in our family hated him. He was the meanest, cheapest son of a bitch that you can imagine. And we were so happy when he died. And I couldn't believe that she said this to me. Anyway, in Mike Jacobs' absence, there was a void, and the void was filled by a man named Frankie Carbo. Frankie Carbo had been in Murder Incorporated, and in Murder Incorporated he had killed 19 people. One of his partners in Murder Incorporated was Bugsy Siegel, who was a close friend of his. In case you don't know it, there was a gang prior to Murder Incorporated called the Bug and Meyer Gang, which was Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. And it was one of the most vicious gangs in New York in the teens. And when they moved on and became proteges of Arnold Rothstein, what they had formed evolved into what was later known as Murder Incorporated, which was a gang of about 100 Jewish and Italian mobsters operating out of Brownsville, Brooklyn. And they killed people for hire. They were retained by 2 major gangsters, Albert, Ms. Mad Hatter Anastasia, and a man, I'm trying to think of his name, Lepke Buchholter. The 2 of them were partners. Lepke Buchholter was eventually indicted and tried for murder by Thomas Dewey, and he is the only mob boss who's ever been electrocuted or sentenced to death in New York. And he and Albert Anastasia ran Murder Incorporated. They paid all of the members of Murder Incorporated a retainer. They could only kill people that they were ordered to kill. And then for each killing, they got a separate fee on top of that. And there was a gangster, whose name I'm trying to recall, Abe Relis, also nicknamed Kid Twist. And he was flipped by the government, and he was testifying against Bugsy Siegel and Albert Anastasia and Lucky Buchholzer and all of these people, and Frank Costello, and they were very, very worried. And the prosecution put him up in a hotel in Coney Island called the Half Moon Hotel. And he was supposed to testify against these mob bosses. And he was being guarded by 6 New York City policemen. And one day he was thrown out of the window, out of the 6-story window of the Half Moon Hotel. And the mobsters used to joke that he was a canary, but he was a canary who couldn't fly. And it turned out that Frank Costello had paid the 6 policemen $100,000 to split between them for throwing rebels out the window. And nothing ever happened to the 6. They were all demoted to a lower rank, but they split $100,000, and that's at a time when cops were, if they were lucky, they were making $3,000 a year. So it was beneficial to them. So after this passed and this problem, Frankie Carbo decided to get involved in boxing. That Murder Incorporated was a little too hot for him. And he partnered with a man named Frank Blinky Palermo, who was the numbers king of Philadelphia. And they partnered with a very, very wealthy man named Jim Norris, whose family at the time owned the Chicago Merchandise Mart and a number of sports teams. And Jim Norris loved hanging around gangsters and boxers, and was thrilled to become a partner of theirs. Their 4th partner, oddly enough, was a man named Truman Gibson. Truman Gibson was a prominent black civil rights lawyer, and he had been hired by Harry Truman after World War II to integrate the armed forces. And he was also Joe Lewis's lawyer and did all of his contracts. Well, the 4 of them formed a partnership. Truman Gibson did the law work, Jim Norris supplied all the funds that they needed, and Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo forced people to sign with them. They controlled every middleweight and welterweight fight that took place in Madison Square Garden. And probably the most famous fight that they fixed was the one of Jake LaMotta. Have you seen the movie Raging Bull? Well, Frankie Carbo was portrayed in that movie as a kind of shadowy figure who goes to Jake LaMotta to get him to throw a fight against a fighter named Billy Fox. And originally, Jake didn't want to do this. Jake thought he could become the middleweight champion on his own, and he was known in boxing circles as the undeclared middleweight champion, but they would never give him a title fight. And Carbo said to him, look, if you want to have a title fight, you're going to have to go along with us. We'll pay you $100,000, and we'll arrange for you to have a title fight. So finally, LaMotta agreed. And not being an idiot, he bet the $100,000 on his opponent to win. And he lost. And it was apparent to everyone who saw the fight that he was intentionally losing. He hardly put up much of a defense. And people in the audience were yelling, fix, fix, and all kinds of other things. And Jake had, I think it was either 5 or 6 additional fights after that, and they finally gave him a shot at the middleweight title. and he fought a French middleweight champion named Marcel Cerdan, and he beat him. And Marcel Cerdan was the fiancé of a famous French singer named Edith Piaf. And he was flying back to New York for a rematch with LaMotta, and his plane crashed in the Azores, killing him. And that ended the possibility of a rematch there. Also, beginning in the early 1950s, televised boxing matches started becoming very popular. In New York, there were the Friday night fights and the Wednesday night fights. And there was a man who was a very good boxing trainer and manager named Ray Arcel, who started broadcasting boxing matches from Boston on Saturday nights. And Carbo and Palermo were very unhappy about this. They wanted to control all the televised boxing matches. And they threatened Arcel a few times, and he didn't acquiesce. And so they sent a thug up to Boston, and while Arcel was on his way to the Boston Arena one night, this thug came up behind him with a lead pipe wrapped in newspaper and smashed him over the head, fractured his skull, and he was in the hospital for 4 weeks. And he was told that if he ever got involved in boxing again, they would kill him. And oddly enough, many years later, the manager of Roberto Duran felt that his fighter needed a good trainer in order to become a successful champion. And he went to Ray Arcel, and he said, "Would you train Roberto? I think you're the only one who can train him to become a champion." And this created a dilemma for Ray, because he knew that if he got involved in boxing, he would be killed. So he said, I'll do it, but I'm not going to take any money for it. And he went to the mobsters in New York, and he told them this. And they said, well, as long as you're not taking any money, it's okay. And he trained Roberto Duran and made him a champion. But they also tried to control Sugar Ray Robinson. And he was the only fighter who really stood up against them. He was considered the best pound-for-pound boxer who ever lived, and probably in the 20th century. And he was so good. He also negotiated his own contracts. He was a very tough negotiator. And Carbo kept trying to get him involved, and he wouldn't go along. And there was nothing the mom could do. They just let him be. There was another fighter named Carmen Basilio, who wanted to become the middleweight champion. And actually, he beat Sugar Ray Robinson in their first fight and became the champion. And they Carbo and Palermo wanted money from him to do this. And he said, I'm not going to give you any money. He said, if my manager wants to give you money, that's fine, but I'm not giving you any money. He said, I've worked hard to achieve what I've gotten so far. And he came from a very poor upstate family of onion farmers in upstate New York. And he had spent his teenage years digging onions out of the ground. And he hated it. And boxing was a way out of poverty for him, and he wasn't about to give up a nickel to these gangsters. And he went to his manager and he said, I'm not doing it. He said, if you want to give him some money, you give him money, but I'm not giving him anything. So the manager wanted Carmen to have a championship fight, so the manager paid $30,000 so that Carmen could have this fight, and he won. Now, Palermo and Carbo were spreading out. They were going all over the country to control things. And there was a welterweight boxer in Los Angeles named Don Jordan who looked like he was going to become a champion. And he had a manager named Jackie Leonard. And Carbo and Palermo were threatening this guy that he had to sign over Don Jordan's contract to them. He refused to do it. So they sent some thugs out to Los Angeles, and they beat the crap out of Jackie Leonard. He went to the local police, and the police wouldn't do anything. And so he went to the Justice Department, and the FBI wired him. And he had another meeting with Carbo and Palermo, and he recorded all of their threats to him. And Robert Kennedy prosecuted Palermo and Carbo and Truman Gibson and Jim Norris. And they were all found guilty. Palermo was given 25 years in prison. I'm sorry, he was given 15 years in prison. Carbo was given 25 years. Jim Norris got off with a slap on the wrist because he was very wealthy and politically connected, and his ability to manage fighters was taken away. He needed a license to be a manager, and that was taken away from him. The same thing with Truman Gibson. He was such a prominent person and so important that he just got a slap on the wrist also. And I think his law license was temporarily put on hold for 6 months, and then it was restored. While they were in prison, Carbo and Palermo were still controlling part of boxing, and they owned part of the contract of Sonny Liston. Now, Sonny Liston is a really sad case. He was born in real dire poverty. His father was a sharecropper in Kentucky, and Sonny was one of 26 children by 2 mothers, and he was the second youngest. And his father used to beat him regularly with a bridle, with a strap, with a stick, with anything. His whole back was scarred. He had those scars on his back for the rest of his life. And his mother left the father. His father's name was Toby. Left Toby and moved to Chicago. She was tired of being beaten up by her husband. And when he was 15, Sonny followed. And what he did is he stole peanuts from a nearby farm, and he sold them as a commodity to get bus fare to Chicago. And he was totally illiterate. He had never been to school. He was enormous. He was a very big guy. And when he got to Chicago, he kept asking people if they knew where his mother was. And you know, Chicago was a big city. They wouldn't know. And one night, the police found him sleeping in an alley behind a restaurant where he used to eat the garbage that was thrown out from the restaurant to feed himself. And they found him sleeping in the alley, and they took him to the police station. They gave him a shower, they got him clean clothes, and they fed him. They got all the information that they could find out about him and his mother, and they were able to locate his mother and reunite them. And he moved in with his mother. But they put him in the 6th grade in a public school. And he couldn't read or write. He was twice the size, maybe 3 times the size of any of the students. They were always making fun of him. And he felt embarrassed, and so he quit school. And he became a member of a gang of kids, delinquents. And for some reason, they committed a lot of robberies, and for some reason, Sonny always wore a yellow shirt when he was committing these robberies. And he became known as the Yellow Shirt Bandit. And when the police were looking for him, all they had to do was find a kid with a yellow shirt, and they knew it was him. And he was getting arrested all the time. And these times, the cops were pretty rough on him. And he resisted arrest while they were rough on him. But he could get hit over the head 3 or 4 times with a billy club, and it didn't seem to bother him. I mean, he was just impervious to pain. And eventually he went to prison, and he was befriended in prison by a Catholic priest who decided that an outlet for his anger, using his strength, would be boxing. And he set up boxing matches for him in the prison with other boxers. And he, because of his strength, he knocked out anyone who got in the ring with him in the first round, usually within a few seconds of the first round. And to the point where boxers were frightened of getting in the ring with him. And when he got out of prison, you know, the mob, he had some amateur fights and then turned professional. When he turned professional, the mob thought, you know, that this is terrific, we can make a fortune from this guy. So mobsters in St. Louis, Chicago, and Las Vegas, and Philadelphia all bought percentages in Sonny Liston's career, and they controlled it. And he won every single fight up until his fights with Muhammad Ali. And the fight in Florida with Muhammad Ali, he wouldn't come out in the 7th round, and they thought that he was just giving up. And he said that he couldn't move his arm. It turned out that they x-rayed his arm, and he had bled from the shoulder into the bicep, and it was true that he couldn't move his arm. There was another fight then scheduled, and none of the mayors of the major cities wanted to fight in their city, not New York, not Philadelphia, not Chicago, not Boston. The only place they could find for a rematch was Lewiston, Maine. There was a lot of money being bet on Muhammad Ali to win. A lot of money being bet by the mob for Muhammad Ali to win, even though the mob owned Sonny Liston. And everyone wanted Muhammad Ali to win. Kennedy brothers, John and Robert, had wanted him to win. They thought Sonny Liston was bad for the black community. The NAACP wanted Muhammad Ali to win. Congress of Racial Equality wanted Muhammad Ali to win. Roy Innes, James Foreman, all these civil rights leaders, they wanted Muhammad Ali to win. Now, there was a gangster in St. Louis named John Vitale, who owned 15% of Sonny Liston's career. And John Vitale's underboss wanted to go to the fight up in Lewiston. And he said to John, I'd like to go to the fight. And Vitale said to him, don't bother, it's going to be over before you get there. And there was a gambler in Las Vegas named Ash Resnick, who also owned a piece of Sonny Liston. And a friend of his said he was going to go up to Lewiston to see the fight. And Ash Resnick said to him, the fight will be over before you get into your seat. Don't waste the money on plane fare. And Geraldine Liston, Sonny's wife, reported to the FBI after the fight. She said to him, I told Sonny, just lay down in the first round. If you're going to lose anyway, why stand there and get hit round after round after round? Just die in the first round. And he did. He went down 1 minute and 44 seconds of the first round. And people called it a phantom punch because most people didn't see the punch that knocked him down. And a lot of people sitting ringside didn't see the punch. And when Muhammad Ali, this famous photograph of Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston, who's lying on the canvas, Muhammad Ali is yelling at him. He's yelling. He's saying, get up, sucker, get up, sucker. No one's going to believe I hit you. Get up. And when Muhammad Ali went back to his corner, he said to his cornerman, he said, did I hit him? I don't think I hit him. Did I hit him? But Muhammad Ali never was involved in a fixed fight. He didn't have to be. But Sonny was. And the mob kind of dropped him afterwards, as they did with Primo Carnera in the 1930s. He had a couple of more inconsequential fights after that. But then he turned on the mob. At first he was dealing heroin in Las Vegas and pinching on a gang's control, the heroin trade in Las Vegas. And a lot of people didn't know that he was taking heroin with Joe Louis, who had become a heroin addict at that time. And he also threatened to go to the Justice Department and tell them about the fixed fights and all the money that was bet and how he was never paid the money he was supposed to be paid. And his wife Geraldine was out of town for a while, and when she came back, there were a lot of newspapers piled up on the front door of their house. She went inside, and she found Sonny dead on the bed. Sonny had been frightened of needles his whole life. He was never vaccinated for anything. Yet, when the coroner came, they found a needle sticking out of a vein in his arm. And the medical examiner said that he had died of an overdose of heroin. It was called a hot shot of heroin. And the medical examiner surmised, without any proof, it was just based on an autopsy, that it seemed as if Sonny had been drinking, and that a drug had been put into his drink that knocked him out. And that while he was knocked out unconscious, two men who were with him, who were drinking with him, had injected the overdose of heroin that killed him. And no one was ever prosecuted. An interesting thing going back to Frankie Carbo, I'm currently writing a book about the history of organized crime in New York, and I interviewed a lot of old mobsters and lawyers and so forth, and I found out from a former mafia head in Philadelphia named Ralph Natali said that it was well known in the mob that Frankie Carbo had killed his best friend, Bugsy Siegel, in Los Angeles in 1947. He had been hired to do that, and it had been okayed by Bugsy Siegel's boyhood friend, Meyer Lansky. So the last chapter of my book deals with Senate investigation into corruption in boxing. And their primary witness in this was Sammy the Bull Gravano, who was in the witness protection program at the time. And he had to testify truthfully or jeopardize his position in the witness protection program. And he said that boxing fixed fights were not the same as they used to be. It had changed dramatically because there was so much money involved in heavyweight championship fights. There would be $10 million, $20 million going to the contestants, or the contenders. He said, well, what we would do is we would find a boxer who we thought had the potential to become a champion, and we would hire a trainer to train him, and a manager to manage him. He wouldn't sign a contract with us, he'd sign a contract with the manager, and the boxer would never know that he was working for the mob, or that the mob owned him. That the manager would know, and the manager would also hire the trainer. The trainer may or may not know. And we may even buy a boxing gym where we could control the entire environment. And then we would bring this fighter along, and we would make sure that he had fights with people that he could beat. And then we would go to, now there are a number of sanctioning bodies. In the 40s and 50s, there was one sanctioning body for each weight division. But now there are like 4 or 5 sanctioning bodies for each weight division. And we would choose a sanctioning body, and we would pay them to rate our fighter as the top contender for the championship. And he went to one sanctioning body for this fighter that they owned, and they wanted $10,000 to make him a contender for the heavyweight championship. And he said, well, I'm asking you on behalf of John Gotti. And they said, well, as a courtesy to John Gotti, we'll reduce it to $5,000. And then we can also determine the outcome by a variety of means. And he wasn't too specific about that, but it had to do with fixing judges, and especially if it looked like there wasn't going to be a knockout, and making sure that the referee broke up the fight if it looked like their guy was losing, they didn't want him to lose. The senator said to him, what would happen if the guy you wanted to win got knocked down? And he said, well, his opponent would know that he should go in there and pick him up. So because the guy has to win the fight, he can't be knocked out. He was making sort of jokes like that about it. And when the senators asked him, what could you do to prevent corruption in boxing? He said, the only way to do it is to reduce the size of the purses. He said, wherever there's this kind of money involved, the mob's going to be there. And there's just no way of keeping them out. So anyway, that's the story of my book. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Is boxing today, I haven't kept up with boxing in recent years, but is boxing today also influenced by the mob? It is.
Yeah, especially the Russian mob. Yeah. There are a lot of Russian fighters out there.
Well, I'd like your opinion, Bob Arum, Don King, and the No Mas fight with Roberto Duran.
Can you repeat the question?
He asked about Don King, Bob Arum, and Roberto Duran's no mas fight, where he didn't want to come out of his corner. Ray Orcel said that Roberto Duran just didn't want to fight anymore. He just had a complete change of heart. I mean, it was like he became a different person. And he said that in the training of Roberto Duran, you could see him becoming more and more humanistic as he went along. He started out as a very tough young guy and liked fighting. And by the time he was getting to the end of his career, he just didn't have it in him anymore. He didn't want it anymore. My previous book was a biography of Rocky Graziano, and the same thing happened to him after he won the middleweight championship. He had been a very angry young man, and his anger was what motivated him to be a successful boxer. But after he became the middleweight champion, he just didn't have that anger anymore, and actually became a very compassionate, empathetic individual, and it was almost impossible for him to get in the ring and fight.
Wow.
Bob Arum wouldn't talk to me. I spoke to other people who know him. They say he's a tyrant. I was going to mention something about Don King in my book, and I tried contacting someone. I reached somebody. I don't know what this person's position was or influence, but he said, Don King doesn't want to be in your book. Don't do it. And there was an implicit threat involved.
Wow. You mentioned that Muhammad Ali wasn't involved with the mob.
No.
How did he escape that? Did he have a choice? I mean,
Well,
that
he was very connected to the black Muslims, and they were very strong, and they protected him. They kept the mob away from him. I mean, he would, and you know, Muhammad Ali was a very, very smart guy. I'm friendly with a man who's an architect who built the Muhammad Ali Museum in St. Louis, and he told me, you know, stories about Muhammad Ali. He was the very bright, very funny, very intelligent guy. Unfortunately, he was in too many fights, and his style of fighting, that rope-a-dope, which permitted him to get hit in the head over and over again, neurologists believe that was the cause of his Parkinson's disease.
I shook hands with him one time, and he was shaking.
Yeah.
That hand was so big.
He was enormous. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, the mob, if you say, had control for quite a number of years, perhaps still has, as you say. I'm curious, though, it would seem to me that Joe Louis and Max Schmeling fights, certainly the mob could not do anything to Max Schmeling. He had the German government, Hitler behind him. Was there any...
No, they had a hard time controlling, they didn't control all of it, and that wasn't controlled. There was some talk that Schmeling was permitted to win the first fight so there could be a rematch. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that Max Baer fought Max Schmeling in 1933, the first year that Hitler came to power. And my father was at that fight. It took place in Yankee Stadium. There were 60,000 people there. And Max Baer was partially Jewish. His father was Jewish, his mother wasn't. And he had a Jewish manager. And Max Baer didn't know anything about Hitler. Hitler just came to power and so forth. And his manager, a man named Ansel Hoffman, told him what Hitler wanted to do to the Jews. And Max Baer decided to have a Jewish star stitched onto his boxing trunks. And he went out and slaughtered Max Schmeling. You can see the fight on YouTube. I mean, the referee had to stop the fight in the 10th round because he was frightened that Max Baer was going to kill Max Schmeling. I mean, from the beginning of round one, he just came out there and it was like a whirlwind, hitting Schmeling. Schmeling had no defense against him. It was just amazing. Max Schmeling, unfortunately, got a bad rap as someone who was during famous Kristallnacht, when they went against all the Jewish stores and burnt the synagogues in Germany, Max Schmeling hid 12 Jewish teenagers in his apartment in Berlin. And he also had a Jewish manager named Joe Jacobs. And when Hitler demanded that he fire him, Max Schmeling said, no, I'm not going to fire him. And there was a funny incident in Berlin in the mid-1930s. And Max Schmeling had a fight there, and he won. And he called Joe Jacobs into the ring with him to congratulate him for winning. And everyone in the stands, gave the Nazi salute. And Mike Jacobs didn't know what to do. He always smoked a cigar. So he put his hand up like that with his cigar in it. And in the news photographs, it looked like he was giving Hitler the finger. And Joseph Goebbels' band had all those photographs removed from the newspapers.
Wow.
Also after, similarly, the way Primo Carnera went to the grave of Max Baer after he died, Max Schmeling, after World War II, went to Joe Jacobs' grave in Brooklyn and paid him respects, that he was one of the best people I ever knew.
I understand that Max Schmeling paid for Joe Lewis's funeral.
That's possible. They were very good friends.
Yeah.
They remained very good. And Max Schmeling got the rights to the Coca-Cola franchise for all of Europe. He became a multimillionaire and lived into his 90s. Yes.
Do you have any plans to do another book with fighters like Gavilan and Sugar Ray Leonard and Patterson and
No.
Foreman? No.
No. I'm going to do another book at the current one I'm working on, which is about organized crime in New York. I'm going to do a book about boxers, but it's a very special niche thing, and I don't want anyone to know exactly what it is until I do it, because I don't want anyone else to get the idea.
You don't want to give a hint?
No, I'm not going to give. No, I'm not telling anybody.
There was, I'm going from memory at this point, but there was a fighter, I think, named Billy Kahn,
Yes,
almost beat Lewis in 41.
right.
I think he maybe caught Lewis flat-footed. He thought he'd have an easy job 10 of it. And then the war came, of course, and the next fight was, I think, 1946. And of course, then Lewis still had enough. Or maybe, was there mob connections behind that fight that Billy Kahn didn't have a chance?
I don't know, but I'm not sure if Mike Jacobs was still controlling Joe Louis at that point. I'm not sure. I don't remember what year exactly Mike Jacobs had his stroke and lost control of Joe Louis. But what happened is the people connected to Carbo and Palermo went to Truman Gibson, Joe Louis's lawyer, and they said, why don't we form a company called Joe Louis Enterprises? Because Joe Louis is getting to the end of his career. And we'll control the boxing. And we'll be a promotion company that'll do all the boxing matches. And then they stole the company from Joe Louis. And he just got screwed left and right. He gave away, donated a lot of money to the war effort in World War II. And a lot of the fights, he set up, they had these fights called the Bum of the Month Club, and he donated most of the money from that to the U.S. Army. And the IRS came after him after the war saying, well, you didn't pay taxes on that money. And they took away almost everything he owned. And he did it out of patriotism. He really got screwed. I mean, he was always getting screwed. He was terrible. Yes.
Rocky Marciano, if I recall, never lost a fight.
49 fights.
Were any of his fights fixed?
They didn't have to be fixed. They were all against losers, including Joe Louis and Archie Moore, because they were well past their prime. I mean, Joe Louis was a bald, flappy guy when he got into the ring with Rocky Marciano. Archie Moore was in his 40s when he got into the ring with Marciano. There was one fighter who put up a good fight against Marciano. His name was Roland Lastarza. and came very close to beating him. There is a story. There was a man named Harry Haft who had been a fighter in Auschwitz. He had to fight in order to stay alive. The Gestapo, the SS made him fight on a regular basis, and if he lost a fight, he would be killed. So he had 70 fights in Auschwitz, and he won all of them. And he got out of Auschwitz, and he thought he'd become a professional boxer. He had 3 fights in New York, and he won. And his next fight was with Rocky Marciano. And monsters told him that if he didn't lose, he'd be killed. Barry Levinson is making a movie about him right now. And after Marciano retired from boxing, he became a collector for the mob.
Okay.
Yeah, collecting mob debts.
It must have been efficient.
He was very efficient. He just looked at you and you wouldn't resist him. He was also a cheapskate. For my Rocky Graziano book, I interviewed Rocky's daughter, Rocky Graziano's daughter, whose name is Roxy. And she said that the 2 Rockies went out to Los Angeles to do a promotion, a television promotion and some other things. And the entire time that they were out there, Marciano claimed he had no money, and Rocky Graziano had to pay for everything for Marciano. And Marciano said he would pay him back, and he never paid him back. Whereas Rocky Graziano was a very generous guy. There was, after he retired from boxing, he used to go to Stillman's gym to watch the up-and-coming fighters. And he saw off in a corner an old fighter who had gone blind, who was living in a transient hotel on the Lower West Side someplace, and he was on welfare. And Rocky went around to everyone in Stillman's gym and collected money from them, 10s and 20s and 50s, and he gave some money himself. And he went over to this guy, and he put all the money in his shirt pocket, and he said, "I want you to come back every month. You're going to get the same thing." Rocky Graziano's wife had to put him on an allowance because she was frightened he was going to give away all of his money. Yes?
Have you gotten any pushback from the boxing industry to your book?
There were a couple of boxing programs that had had me on for my previous books that wouldn't have me on for this book because they didn't want to deal with the fact that mobsters are involved with boxing. I mean, it's an open secret, so I don't know why, but they didn't want to do it. Anything
Sounds
else?
like a lifetime of investigation and gathering of information.
No, I'm very fortunate. There's a reference librarian in East Hampton named Stephen Spataro, who, when I ask him if he could help me find old newspaper articles and that, he's able to dig up anything I want. It's just so I always acknowledge him in the acknowledgments of my books because he's been terrifically helpful to me.
The Floyd Patterson, do you think that first that fight with Ali was any mob involved?
No, but you know who owned Patterson after the company that Carbo and Palermo and those guys had was forced out of business, and another company took its place called 20th Century Promotions, and that was run by the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn, by Fat Tony Salerno, who was a mafia boss in New York, and a man named Bill Fugazi, whose family was tangentially involved in the mob. You may remember Fugazi limousines, and they controlled Patterson. They owned Patterson.
Did you say Lucchese?
Fugazi.
Oh,
William Fugazi. F-U-G-A-Z-Y.
I don't remember the name.
Family also owned a private bank in Little Italy, which doesn't exist anymore.
The case of Floyd Patterson, the fights with Ingemar Johansson, I take it that Johansson caught Patterson on a bad night with that so-called punch. Patterson did not take a fall, did he?
No.
In that first fight, he just got a lucky punch.
I think so.
Thereafter, I think the next 1 or 2 fights, naturally, he was wiped out, you know.
Well, they had 2 fights, I think it was. Yeah.
Was it 2? Yeah.
I think it was 2, yeah. In the mid-1980s, I was doing the publicity for a welterweight fighter named Howard Davis, who had been an Olympic gold medalist. He was in the same Olympics as Sugar Ray Leonard. And he was a wonderful human being, just a delightful guy. And he used to train at a gym that's no longer in existence called the Times Square Gym, which was on West 42nd Street. And I used to go there and watch him fight, and then I would arrange for newspaper and magazine interviews for him. And I was talking to one of the characters who was hanging around at the gym. He was a gambler, actually. And this was, I guess, around 1984, 85. And I said to him, you think fights are still being fixed now? And he said, oh, sure they are. And I said, well, how do you think they're fixing them? I said, do you think they're fixing the fighter? He said, no, we don't have to fix the fighter. We just have to buy one judge and it's fixed for us. It was like a character out of a Guys and Dolls. And any other questions? Anyone who wants to buy my book, I'll be happy to sell it to them and autograph it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.